The Xiu Chang Saga. A story by user Hume Reddit. A Wounded Rabbit. Part 1. Date point: 2 years, 8 months after Vancouver. Rimward border of Dominion Station, Hopeful Endeavor. Orbiting Hirgaranus 14. She had a name once. She hadn't used it for a very long time. Meat slaves weren't permitted names. They were food, sometimes labor, and it made no sense to give a name to something that was going to be eaten anyway. Somehow she'd escaped that particular fate. She'd been judged more useful to work, to fetch drink, and to rub oils onto the Master of Masters, the most terrifying of all the masters, to salve the places where its cybernetic augmentation joined with its flesh, perpetually within inches of horrible death, and always yearning for it. It was the common wish of all the meat slaves, that when death came, because nothing could stop it, that it be swift and painless. Even trying to escape their fate through suicide was punished horrifically. Death arrived when the masters allowed it, not before. She really had no idea whether she'd avoided that fate or not. She wasn't in the care of the masters anymore, but she could always feel them, like the cold of a shadow. There was no escaping them. The galaxy was theirs, the sapients within, their prey, and life and death was always at their whim. She knew she could be taken again at any time, just like anyone else, and the most she could hope for was that the Master of Masters would acknowledge her obedience at having delivered its message. Maybe she'd be fortunate, and the Master wouldn't play with its food before consuming her. The terror had been with her all her life, and she was used to it. The sapients she'd delivered the Master of Masters' message to, she didn't know what they called themselves, but the Masters called them eggheads, sticklegs, and the herd, weren't as accustomed to it, and words she'd been commanded to deliver frightened them. It was strange. They sometimes looked at her as if she was one of the Masters themselves, and she didn't like it. Other times they became angry, and fired questions at her so quickly that she sometimes didn't have a chance to answer before the next was spoken. Eventually she ran out of answers to give, and she was handed over to an egghead. His attitude was refreshingly cold, simply examining her for some purpose she didn't understand. He also snidely told her that he was a courtai, commanding her to stop referring to his people as eggheads. She was grateful for the order. Obeying was all she knew how to do. The aimlessness since she'd arrived and delivered her message had been upsetting. She worried a bit when he drew blood, as slaves that were overly damaged were relegated to food status. But the mark was small and easy to ignore, and she didn't think it would harm her ability to serve. "Your name is apparently Triman," he said in a bored voice, reading one of the holographic displays in what was called a medical bay. "You were on one of the early colonization vessels sent out by Gao." It disappeared without a trace. She barely remembered the before time, before the Masters had taken them. The word Triman did echo vaguely in the back of her mind. It was strange to have a name. "What do I do now?" she'd asked. The Master of Masters wasn't here to command her. Who was she to obey? The courtai had looked at her with his huge black eyes. He seemed annoyed. "Do whatever you want. It's none of my concern." She was handed off between many of the aliens, and none of them could answer her simple question. Eventually she was given clothes, which were meant for her species. Simple overalls in gray with pockets that she could see could be useful. Then she was released, placed into the common areas of the space station she was in, told to seek her species. They'd take care of her. She had no idea what that meant or how to accomplish it. She didn't know where to go or who to talk to. All she could do was wait. She'd been given a small bag of nutrient spheres. She recognized them as the feed the Masters would give the slaves, looted from the ships taken as the Masters hunted their own food. She ate them very slowly, barely a bite a day. Like all slaves, she knew food was never guaranteed, and it was important to be conservative. She slept in the corridors of the station. The blue sticklegs prey, the Vizcatic, who were part of the station's security, would tell her to move along, and she'd seize the orders given with the desperation of an addict. But while they'd tell her to go, they would never tell her where she should go. Eventually, a white sticklegs, Rikatupcher, she was told, gave her a fresh bag of nutrient spheres and put her on a ship, which took her to a different station. There the cycle repeated, and she was put on a ship to yet another station, pushed, like trash, further and further from the core of galactic civilization. Triman wasn't offended, merely confused. She wished someone would give her an order. The latest station she was on was far dingier than any of the previous. The lights were all half-lit to save power, and some sections of the large space outpost weren't livable by any species. Machinery broke, and some sectors reeked of steam or chemicals. Others were flooded, or unheated, or didn't receive enough breathable air. Despite that, there were a lot of prey, sapients, aboard the station, most of whom favored the inner core where the heat and the lights worked. They would talk and joke and exchanged items, very friendly as long as they knew you. If they didn't, it was best to stay far away. Triman watched them from the edges. She was tired and weak, her fur grungy and matted. The beings here were less inclined to pity her and offer her food or water. She'd found a pipe deep in the station that leaked water that didn't seem poisonous. But she was left with the last crumbs of her last nutrient sphere, so she tried to keep the hunger away by limiting her activity. She'd found a conduit along a wall in a dark corridor that radiated heat, whether it was supposed to or not, and would sleep there. It was there that the strange being found her. "Sister?" Triman looked up at the figure who had spoken to her. The creature was not one of the station's security, who were almost all long-necked Vizcatic carrying strange devices on harnesses. Instead, the being was barely as tall as she was, clad in a long gray cloak that hid every bit of her flesh from view. A carrying bag was slung over one shoulder, and the glove that covered the paw that was held out to her could have easily fit on her own. The words were her words, the words she'd been allowed to keep, the reason the Master of Masters had commanded her to bring the words to the Dominion. She realized she'd been staring when the figure hunched over a little further and spoke again. "Sister, are you well?" The voice was laden with a strong, strange accent. Triman couldn't remember ever having been asked that question before, so she had no idea how to answer. "Are you here to tell me to leave?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse. The figure seemed to flinch. "What? No, The being hesitated, and the cloaked head turned to take in the surroundings. "Sister, how long have you been sleeping here?" "I don't know. Why do you call me sister?" The question brought a curious noise from the being. "You are Gaoian, aren't you?" She paused to think. It sounded like a word the Kortai had used to describe her. "I think so. Does that mean I'm a sister?" "Yes," the creature replied. "I'm a sister too." It paused, and its head shook from side to side in a strange gesture. "What's your name?" She'd been asked the same question when she'd been picked up by the prey vessels after being dropped off by the masters. She hadn't known the answer then, but this time she did. "Triman." "Triman," the creature repeated. "When was the last time you ate something, Triman?" One paw absently touched the pouch which had held her nutrient spheres. It had been very light for many sleep cycles. "I don't know. The night cycles in this place confuse me." All her answers seemed to be upsetting the being more and more. She hoped she hadn't done something wrong. The creature was silent for long moments. Then, finally, it held out a paw to her. She stared at it curiously. "Come with me, sister." Triman had no idea what the creature would do, but it had given her a command, and she needed that almost more than food or water. She scrambled to her feet too quickly. The sudden movement and malnutrition made her dizzy. She staggered, but the being caught her before she fell, holding her up with all the ease of a bulkhead. "Careful," the cloaked being said softly. "Take a breath. We don't have to rush." Triman obeyed, pausing until the dizziness passed. She also cast sideways glances at the other sister. Even standing, it was almost impossible to see inside the hood. The other female, she assumed it was female anyway, was wearing a scarf across her face. The scarf extended out in a way that implied a muzzle like Triman's own, and above it there was the glitter of dark eyes surrounded by pinkish skin. "Do you feel better?" Triman bobbed her head. "Okay, we'll go this way to my ship. If you get tired or I walk too fast, let me know." She paused. "You can call me Xiu, by the way." "Xiu," she repeated. It was a strange name, but then so was her own as far as she was concerned. Xiu relaxed slightly as Triman spoke her name. She gestured and the two began to walk down the corridor, to where the slave knew the docking bays were located. They walked silently, though Triman often glanced sideways at her new companion. She still didn't know what Xiu intended with her, but it didn't matter. Eventually, her curiosity got the better of her, and she surprised herself when she found her muzzle moving almost of its own accord. "If you are the same people as I, should I wear a cloak as well?" she asked. Xiu's head turned briefly. Soft, strange sounds emitted from under the cloak and then suddenly stopped. No. Gaoians don't wear clothing like this most of the time. It pulls on the fur and is annoying, she explained. Me? Well, I have a condition. No fur. It's very embarrassing. I wear this to hide it. Oh, Triamond replied. She tried to imagine herself without fur. It would look very strange. She knew what other fur faces, Gaoians, were supposed to look like, of course, and she'd seen Gaoians without fur, but of course, they were also without skin, mere moments before the masters consumed them. The lucky ones were also without life before that happened. Xiu paused as Triamond made a tiny whimpering sound at the memory. Triamond? Are you okay? Again that question. I don't understand, she answered timidly. What does okay mean? The sound of a long exhalation came from beneath the hood. Xiu raised a gloved paw as if to touch Triamond's shoulder, but hesitated and lowered it instead. It means happy, healthy, and you aren't. Let me help you. Why? Triamond finally asked. Amongst the masters, the slaves who were too sociable, too helpful to the others, were the first to be eaten. The ones that survived the longest were the ones who hesitated to speak, to associate. They lived among each other without bonding, allowing only their misery and wish for a swift end to unite them. It made it easier when the inevitable occurred. She could tell that Xiu was staring at her from underneath the cloak. Because you're my sister, she answered. Triamond allowed Xiu to guide her the rest of the way to the docking bays. She led them into one of the cavernous private hangars, where a large shuttle, or perhaps a small ship, lay quietly. The hangar's door to space was closed, and the lights were as dim there as everywhere else on the station. But the low light seemed not to bother Xiu at all, even with her hood up. The berth was roomy, built to accommodate ships built for the other races of the galaxy, who were almost invariably larger than Gaoians. But clutter robbed the area of usable space. Visitors would leave their trash in the hangar before departing, leaving the station management to deal with it. Of course, the management didn't care, so it piled up endlessly until a visitor would either scavenge it or throw it out into space in annoyance. Polymer storage containers stuffed one corner, and bits of debris or discarded ship parts lined the walls. In one corner, near where the huge door would slide upwards to reveal the blackness of space, a maintenance project had apparently begun, and then been abandoned. Scaffolding climbed the metal walls nearly to the distant ceiling. The shuttle definitely looked out of place inside the drabby hangar, even to her naive eye. It was painted and smooth, in good repair, which contrasted greatly with the exposed framework and piles of spare parts of the hangar. Xiu walked over to the rear of the ship and tapped on its hull. A holographic display appeared, and she gestured a pattern in the air with the digits of one paw. The back bottom of the vessel split open and slowly lowered, forming a ramp. Triamond followed Xiu up the ramp, glancing around curiously at the brightly lit interior, so different from the rest of the station. The masters didn't like light that was too bright, and so the poor lighting of the rest of the station was both comfortingly and terrifyingly familiar. They were in some kind of cargo area, she guessed. The ceilings were very high, much like the stations, built for races that tended to be much larger. The controls were placed in positions reachable even for short species, and Xiu had no trouble as she tapped the wall, closing the ramp behind them. Leading her up one of a pair of ramps that led to the upper level of the ship, Xiu gestured as she spoke. You wouldn't think it, but this is apparently just a long-range shuttle. It's foolishly big, though. It's meant for many species, but mostly for Governor Ragna... She flapped a paw. The big ones with lots of fur and color stripes. The galley is up here. They entered another room filled with appliances and some utility tables, with another hovering table off to one side, near some crystal matrix windows that looked out onto the dreary shabbiness of the hangar. Triamond's sensitive nose caught the scent of the food that had been prepared in the room previously, and her stomach clenched painfully as her hunger asserted itself again. She was well used to ignoring such aches, so she said nothing, but her stomach spoke for her as it growled quietly. Xiu's hearing was surprisingly sharp, and her head turned to regard the female from beneath her hood. You must be very hungry. Do you want me to cook you something? Or should we start you with something more bland, like a nutrition sphere? She could only blink at the question. She'd only ever known eating what she was given. I don't understand. Xiu stared at her quietly, and she battled the need to fidget, worrying that she'd answered the question wrong. Finally, the other spoke gently. Okay, a nutrition sphere, and a cup of water, I think. Maybe I'll have the same. Have a seat. This won't take long. I hope you don't mind if I ask you some questions while we eat. Ima knew that their new, nomadic life was difficult for Xiu, all the more so because she felt like she was dragging the Gaoian mother and Regari on the run with her. But feelings were rarely based on logic. If anything, it was Ima who'd forced the life upon her, stealing her human friend away even as she lay sleeping on her hoverbed in the medical bay of the rich plains. It had been strange working together with Furfeg, who, up to that point, she'd actively despised. The diplomat ran interference, arranging for security patrols to be diverted and for the captain's yacht of the diplomatic vessel to have its security protocols left open. Finding Regari waiting inside the yacht when they arrived had also been surprising, and yet not. His arm still encased in its protective kinetic brace, the White Crest male had glared at her, but it had been the kind of glare that wasn't scolding her for what she was about to do, but for not inviting him along as they did it. "We're leaving, Officer Regari," she said. "We don't know when we'll be back to Gao. If ever. You have duties. My current duty is escorting you and Sister Xiu," he responded. The yacht wasn't equipped with the translators that helped the two Gaoians pronounce the human's name. The Mother Supreme didn't place conditions on that assignment. I knew it would come to this as soon as I heard the general broadcast, and I'm guessing Ambassador Furfeg agreed. If he noticed her staring at him rather stupidly, he was too polite to comment on it. So, are we stealing this ship or not? Getting away had been appallingly easy. The shuttle bay was still a shambles because of the Hunter attack, and the rich plains still hadn't brought its FTL back online. They were out and away before anyone even protested, and Ima had her suspicions that the lack of response was because the crew of the rich plains were only too happy to have the human away, even though they all owed their lives to her. They'd been sitting in space nearly 2 Gaoian days later, deep in the black and far from commonly traveled lanes, when Xiu finally woke from her drug-induced healing sleep. Regari had been in the yacht's cockpit, quietly hacking the ship's registry identifier. She didn't ask where he learned to do so. So it had been up to Ima to explain to Xiu where she was and why. Why? Without the translator, Xiu was forced back to her simple Gaori, and it was a struggle for her to remember the words under the weight of the drugs and her injuries. Why did they do this? They took us. Now scared we here? Kill us for being? Ima had no explanation other than the obvious. They're scared. Scared and stupid. As Ima had suspected, Xiu utterly rejected the idea of returning to Gao and placing it in danger. In fact, she demanded that Gao make a statement that the lone human had left the world, just for the sake of those ears that might be listening. She slipped into a depression even worse than the one when she'd learned her home system had been caged. And this time there were no cubs to drag her out of it. Her metabolism burned through the few painkillers they'd been able to steal from the medical bay swiftly, so healing was a long and painful process. Ima hid her fear that the neural damage Xiu had suffered from the nerve jam grenade hadn't been completely repaired, but after 3 10 days with no seizures or other effects, she was pleased to, grudgingly, concede that Tra was every bit as talented as the court eye doctor claimed. A few 10 days later, Regari and Xiu removed their kinetic braces together, although Regari immediately began training himself, recovering the mobility and strength he'd lost while his broken elbow repaired itself. Xiu did not. In fact, she spent much of her time sleeping. Her body had recovered, her spirit had not. In many ways, her depression seemed too severe, and Ima worried. Tra had muttered something about how finely tuned the human brain was, as delicate as their bodies were sturdy. It was why they were so vulnerable to nerve jam grenades, as it took little to upset that balance. Xiu had avoided paralysis and seizures, but there were other, finer damage that had been... But was there other, finer damage that had been done? If there was, what could they do about it? They couldn't visit a doctor, not in the current political climate. Fortunately, there were other, non-medical ways of helping her friend. The first had been taken by Regari, and Ima wondered why she'd ever thought of leaving him behind. The yacht was a bulky thing. For a Governor Raghavendra gun, it was merely comfortable, but for the smaller species like Gaoians or humans, it was cavernous. The upper deck held the cockpit and the galley, while the lower deck contained the small medical bay and 3 sleeping areas. The latter third of the ship was a large storage area, spanning both decks, the rear bulkhead capable of swinging downward to form a ramp for loading and offloading. Regari had instructed Ima to wait in the storage area. Curious and bemused, she'd obeyed, while he went to fetch the lone human, who was moping in the room they all slept in. Then he demonstrated that combat, hijacking, and hacking weren't the least of the knowledge the White Crest bodyguard possessed. For instance, it was thought that nothing short of anti-tank weaponry could dislodge an obstinate human. Regari proved otherwise. Simply grip the upper part of a human's ear with 2 digits of a paw, and partially unsheath your claws. The human will become quite compliant. Ow, ow, Rigari, stop! Ima blinked as the other Gaoian led Xiu into the bay. The human's ear was held in his paw. Her face was twisted in pain. And though she was perfectly capable of swinging the Gaoian over her head, she was hunched over as her arms flapped impotently. She cursed in both of her human languages and even included a few choice Gaori words that Ima was quite certain she hadn't learned from her. She sighed and made a mental note to scold Yelna on her next message home. Enough, Rigari said coldly as he released her. She rubbed at her ear and grumbled, but didn't test him by trying to return to her bed. The male reached over and picked up his pulse rifle where it had been leaning against a bulkhead. He held it in front of him. It is time both of you learned how to use one of these. Ima startled, but Xiu voiced surprise for both of them. You want us to learn? She struggled for the word. Shooting? I want you to learn to shoot, yes. But why? I hit things. It's better. Except when your enemy has a nerve jam grenade, he pointed out sternly. She wilted in remembered pain. But why? Why Ima too? He looked at her as though the answer was obvious. Because you are sisters, and sisters protect each other. The human had reluctantly learned how to use the weapon, as had the Gaoian mother, but that was hardly the limit of the male's plans. A couple of days later, he unveiled the second part, a long gray cloak which would cover Xiu from head to toe, a pair of gloves, and even a scarf to cover her face, which had even had a conical piece of plastic attached to the inside to imitate a Gaoian's muzzle. You are Sister Xiu, he explained. A Gaoian female who is unfortunately burdened by Hayari syndrome. Ima winced. Hayari was a humiliating genetic affliction, one that caused a Gaoian's fur to fall out in large patches. Then her ears flicked as she realized the male's brilliance. Why? Xiu had asked as she held the garments, but her voice wasn't as downtrodden as it had been before. Because in 2 days' time we will arrive at the station Onward Endeavor, he said. I will need to visit the station communications center to make my report to the Mother Supreme. And while I do so, you and Mother Ima will pick up supplies. Ima had been incredibly nervous, her fur practically standing on end. Xiu wore her cloak and scarf, shuffling quietly alongside her as they walked through the station. She was acutely aware of Xiu's accent when she spoke, of the immovable density of the human when they'd bump into each other, navigating the crowded confines of the marketplace that stretched across several levels in the cylindrical core of the station. But it worked. They were both newcomers, so her slightly bewildered look was really no different from the Gaoian females. Gaoians were still relatively rare across the Dominion, the member world too new for anyone to have bothered learning the language themselves. And translators hid accents. The other denizens of the station would glance at them, and then their gaze would shift away to find something more interesting. Even the station quartermaster dismissed the disguised human, standing not 2 paces away from her with a bored sniff. It was bold. It was risky. It was exactly what the human needed. If Xiu had imitated Ima well while outside, then she was doing a more than passable imitation of little Myun when they returned, nearly bouncing off the walls. The difference in their friend was like night and day. She took to wearing the cloak even while they traveled in the yacht, and she seemed to watch Ima with a critical eye. It was strange, and a little disconcerting, honestly. She is studying how you move, Rigari explained when Ima commented on it to him. She thought nothing could disturb the businesslike demeanor of their bodyguard, but he was visibly amused. The humans stand taller, and they walk with long strides. Do you see any of that when she's wearing her disguise? And in truth, she didn't. She was also embarrassed to note that Xiu had taken to moving her gloved fingers in imitation of the way Ima would pick her sheathed claws against one another in idle thought. You forget that she was studying to be an actress on her homeworld, Rigari pointed out. And yes, he was definitely amused. The content may be different, but human actors value the same things our own do. Surrendering yourself to the role. The disguise worked perfectly on the next station, and the next. Rigari was the one choosing their course, and neither questioned him on his choice of ports of call. Ima did note that their course generally took them along an arcing path that was nearly on the opposite side of the Dominion from Erbzerk Station, where the infamous human who had ignited the war with the hunters had been sighted. A lazy tour of backwater stations where sapients who wanted to be left alone weren't remarkable, and the curiosity and concern about the Deathworlder species wasn't quite as intense. It was on the 3rd station that Xiu found her small piece of home. Ima! Ima! Look at this! Ima wandered over from where she'd been speaking to the bored-looking Rua, her quartermaster. The details of having the yacht's consumables resupplied had been dealt with, so it was one less worry. Meanwhile, Xiu had wandered a small distance. Scanning the station commercial area from underneath her hood, a shop had caught her eye, a vendor of curios. In the front of the shop, in a large case protected by transparent crystal and visibly threatening alarm systems, was a preserved animal. Aima twitched her muzzle in distaste. Killing animals and displaying the corpse was not something Gaoians did, though she knew of the practice. She had to admit that this creature cut an imposing figure, even deceased. It was covered in orange fur decorated with black stripes, and it had been posed in a ferocious stance, its teeth bared from its whiskered muzzle. It reminded her of a gricka, but no gricka had ever grown so large, thank the stars. This creature was as long as Aima was tall, and its paws, nearly 4 times the size of her own, held claws that looked fit for shredding starship hull. "It is a tiger," Xiu said, and her voice was a mixture of awe and surprise, and she struggled not to speak too loudly. "It is from Earth." "Really?" Aima replied, sharing her surprise. She looked at the creature's teeth, which looked more than a match for a vulza. "Creatures like this live on your world?" "Not many," Xiu replied, her accent stronger than usual. Aima realized she was angry. "There are not many tigers. They are very rare, very precious, very beautiful, and someone has killed one to display." Aima had her reservations about calling such a clearly dangerous animal beautiful, but it was obviously very important to her human friend, so she didn't argue. Fortunately, she was spared by the shopkeeper wandering over. She laid a paw on Xiu's arm as the elderly Robalin wandered over with its wobbling 3-legged gait, a silent signal to be cautious and a comforting gesture. She knew of the human's phobia of insectile species. She herself eyed him with a suspicious gaze. "I see you admiring our centerpiece," the alien said congenially. The shop was fitted with a merchant's translator, no implants required, but with a more limited set of languages and tonalities. There was no way to know if the smarminess of his voice came from him or the machinery. "A fascinating creature, is it not? Apparently they are called tigers." Xiu made a small choking noise, but his eyes only briefly flickered to her. He leaned in toward Aima, identifying her as the one in charge. "They are from the human homeworld, you know," he said as if sharing a secret. "A deadly, vicious creature from a world full of deadly creatures. No intelligent being would be so irrational as to visit such a place. But I have artifacts from the world to save you the danger." As he gestured toward the shelves at the back of his shop, all covered in kinetic fields, it was on the tip of Aima's tongue to ask if he meant he relied on idiots to fetch his stock, but she restrained herself. Still, he had a surprising amount of salesmanship for a species mostly known for backstabbing. "Truly. Human items." "Oh, yes. You are from Gao, yes? I understand your people have some fascination with the species. Even sheltered one for a brief time." "Not anymore," she replied ambiguously. "Yes, I heard," he replied, making a gesture which she assumed meant agreement. "A wise decision. They're far too dangerous to keep around, and not just because the hunters pursue them." She could feel Xiu fuming behind her. Still, "Let's take a look, Sister Xiu," she said. Xiu hid her surprise. "Of course, Mother," she replied in Gaori. The cases in the back of the shop held a number of objects, none of which she dared ask Xiu to identify in front of the shopkeeper. Worse, they were all ridiculously expensive. While Rigari's credit chit had a surprising capacity, which she'd not questioned him about, throwing about too many credits at once was wasteful and a sure way to unwelcome scrutiny. But Aima was determined that she wouldn't leave the shop empty-pawed. Fortunately, physical objects weren't the only thing the shopkeeper had. Sensing the 2 females were about to walk away without buying anything, he reluctantly revealed that he also possessed media, digital information stolen from the human homeworld, gigaquads of music, art, video, all neatly copied, converted to common formats, and stored on a data chip. It was an effective compromise, and Aima paid him gladly, even though it was still far more than she planned on spending that day. Xiu's eyes were wide behind her scarf as Aima turned and handed the chip to her. "Aima, let's go back and see what we've got, shall we?" Xiu's little data chip quickly became her most treasured possession. She would spend vast swaths of her waking time sorting through the archive, curating and organizing the contents, eager to show the 2 Gaoians the pieces she thought most interesting. Much of the video had been rated from something called YouTube, she explained, banal and boring, although it did offer Aima and Rigari their first glimpses of other humans, males and females, adults and cubs, and of their homeworld. It was a pretty world, Aima decided. The climate and geological variance was astonishing. Between desert and tundra, jungle and ocean, canyons and mountains, yet they were attractive in their extremes, even if Ima would never want to live there. The humans certainly seemed to enjoy it, though she definitely had to question the sanity of those who paused to film a tornado or earthquake, or even actively chased them. Then Xiu found and played something called river dance, and they were rapt. Dozens of humans, moving with astonishing coordination and strength. Other species might be able to emulate the motions, but never with such effortless grace. Gravity simply meant less to the humans, and there was only motion and music. And the music! Ima actively disliked most of what was found on the data chip, with its rough rhythms and thumping beats. But the music that these humans danced to was joy turned to sound, and they transformed themselves into instruments with their tapping feet. There were other treasures on the chip, but river dance remained Ima's favorite. It was interesting to see Xiu expound on the stories and meaning behind the movies, despite her still somewhat limited vocabulary. And Ima was reminded again that this was her clan sister's area of study. She was surprised by the depth of it. Humans seemed to love allegory and metaphor, meanings both blatant and subtle. Even the position of the recording device could be selected to appear ominous or exciting. That one spontaneous purchase raised Xiu's spirits immensely, and Ima congratulated herself on credits well spent. She also made careful note of how her friend would watch the human actor Chow Yun-Fat with a very intent gaze. She suspected if he were to appear out of thin air, Xiu would offer him a mating contract on the spot. Useful data for teasing later. It was a few 10 days after that discovery that they arrived back at the yacht to find Rigari waiting for them, with another piece of hope. As usual, the male had made a visit to the communications center of the station as the two females replenished the yacht's food, fuel, and breathables. On-ship communications equipment tended to be limited, and stations had the facilities for bulk FTL data transfer. Rigari would take the video letters the two females would put together, Ima to the other mothers of their home commune, and Xiu would put together greetings and gung fu lessons from Yun and the other cubs, all of whom missed the human terribly, and encrypt them using a cipher available only to the Mother Supreme and the others of the White Crest clan. He would bundle them with his own report to Gaoian and send them off, waiting patiently for the encrypted data packet containing the reply. It was on that day that the data packet contained something extra, a name provided by the Mother Supreme and the agents of the Ebony Paw clan. Who? Asked Xiu, confused. He is a former Rikatupcha politician and representative to the Dominion, Rigari explained. The three sat around the main table, lowered to a comfortable height for the humans and Gaoians, eating the delicious end-of-day meal prepared by Xiu. He distinguished himself in helping repulse a hunter raid upon the station Outlook on Forever, an act which helped launch his political career. He resigned shortly after the force field was placed around your homeworld. Since then, he's been spotted on several worlds and stations where humans have been, and when he leaves, they are gone. He takes them again? She asked, furious. Human anger could be as quiet as their misery, but Ima had learned the signs. No, sister, he replied. Spoke often in favor of your people. In fact, he was given a human nickname, Kirk. Kirk? She repeated, incredulous. The strange name rolled off her tongue much more naturally. Her eyes widened. He saves them! Rigari nodded. The Mother Supreme and the other clan leaders believe so. Alright guys, that's going to be it for today. We had a little bit of a longer one today, and I'm glad too, because I actually managed to get this one into one part. That is probably, I don't know, after editing, it's about 45 minutes right now, but after editing I could probably get it down to like 38, 39. I did a few screw-ups here and long stretches of silence, so we'll see. Excuse me. Regardless, guys, thank you so much again for being here. I hope you guys liked the 3 videos I put out yesterday. I know it was a little cheeky. You guys all thought that was pretty funny, and I'm glad you weren't mad for some strange reason, but, you know, I just thought it would be fun, you know, make up for a little bit of the lost time that, you know, we had this week with me being gone. So thanks again so much for your patience this week, guys. Thank you so much for being here, as always, and spending this time with me. I know that it is incredibly precious, so I appreciate any amount of time that you all spend with me, and I will see you all in the next one. Thanks, guys.